As someone who is a big movie fan, I know that oftentimes in the course of a series or franchise, the third film will be the shittiest. I assume that the Democratic debates are a kind of art form. They're similar to movies in that they're long and sometimes overproduced, or in this case, underproduced if you looked at the microphone quality. And the third debate in this case, I can only hope, will be the low point for the debates, because this was an absolute shit show and a train wreck. I was angry at having wasted 3 hours of my time watching this bullshit. And I put almost all of the blame on ABC and the DNC. First of all, there was no real impactful moment in this debate. Nothing happened in this debate that I will remember going forward past the next week or so. There were no memorable moments, there was no meaningful substance. There was also not really much on the issue of climate change. That is a major issue, and it should be front and center right now, given how many hurricanes we've had since the last debate. You would think it would come up, but it hasn't. That's bizarre. That's bad framing. They talked about guns because of recent mass shootings, but not climate change. Okay. One thing that really angered me is the way that ABC showed explicit and undeniable bias toward Joe Biden. So, first of all, they decided to begin the debate by posing a question that allowed him to attack both Bernie and Warren, the two candidates nipping at his heels and gaining on him. And he was able to attack their position of Medicare for all and then bring in his moderate cohorts from the sides to help him out. So that was designed to make Joe Biden look smarter, and he did okay in that part of the debate, so he made something of that opportunity. Later on, when they were closing, they decided the last question of the night would not be a closing statement like a normal debate, but rather, what is the biggest obstacle you've ever overcome in your life? Start first, Mr. Vice President. Now, Joe Biden famously at one point lost his wife and one of his children in a car wreck. Later on, I think back in 2015 or 16, he lost another son to brain cancer. None of the other candidates have a story which even comes close to equaling or surpassing what Joe Biden has been through. So that question was clearly tailored specifically for him, as no one else really had much of an answer for it, at least not anything good. So without the closer after that, this leaves the impression that Biden did way better than he actually did. He was given very favorable treatment at the beginning and the end, and then he sagged throughout the middle of the debate. Another problem I had with ABC is that they tried to provide framing and they hired a bunch of analysts who are people who should not be anywhere near a newsroom. They had Rahm Emanuel and Heidi Heitkamp. Rahm Emanuel is a political hack. He is the former mayor of Chicago who's the chief of staff of Obama. He used to head the DCCC. This guy is what I would call a vehement moderate, or a hardcore corporate centrist. He is adamantly opposed to anyone running a campaign that's in any way left of center. When he was head of the DCCC, he refused to fund progressive campaigns, and he would urge all of his candidates to run to the center, and he would punish them by withholding donations if they didn't. The guy's a total hack, and he is completely out of step with our current political climate. The fact that he still has a career is a disgrace, and anyone giving him money is complicit in his idiocy. As for Heidi Heitkamp, she is a former Democratic senator from the Dakotas. She got wiped out because she was trying to run as Republican light in a Republican state, and that will only get you so far for so long. She thinks that she, like Claire McCaskill, is a model for how to succeed because apparently she forgot that she lost. So of course, both of them were on Team Moderate, and not surprisingly, they advocated going center, and then said that at the end, the centrist won the debate. Shock and surprise. Who could have seen that coming, as if that wasn't a predetermined outcome for those two particular analysts? The big story of the night, according to the experts, is that Julian Castro was mean. He was mean to Joe Biden. He attacked him for his age and memory. How dare he? Because that's what Americans really worry about. They don't worry about what their health insurance is like. They don't worry about their wages, the environment, American wars of intervention. No, 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 no. They're worried that Julian Castro, one of the candidates that they don't recognize on stage, was mean to the former vice president. That's what keeps people up at night. Now, for me personally, this is a dumb story. I don't really care if Castro was mean or not. I have no interest in civility. I think it's massively overrated. We can and do go without civility all the time. It makes no difference. That is window dressing, which helps elite people feel comfortable around other elite people. It has nothing to do with me or you. The thing that really pissed me off, though, and that put me in a white-hot fury for about an hour or two after the debate, is the amount of dick-sucking of Barack Obama in this debate. Apparently, and I didn't realize this, one of my friends told me later, there was a poll after the first and second debates where people thought that any critiques of Obama were unwarranted, and within the Democratic base, he's still massively popular. He's polling at over 90-something%, and people are just enamored with the memory of Barack Obama. Okay, so I get why people were trying to cozy up to Obama, especially Biden, because that's really his only strategy. But here's a dose of objective reality. If we judge a president by what they said they were going to do and what they actually accomplished, Obama is, on an objective level, a failed president. There's no getting around that. The man was a failure. He failed to do most of the things he set out to do. He is not a model of success. We need to move on from Obama. He is not worth defending. He is someone we need to move past. We need to remember the lessons of Obama and then do way better than Obama so we can never talk about him again. He was a failed experiment. That's all he'll ever be. The end. That's the truth. If we actually want to make reforms that will make the world a better place, then the last person we should turn to for advice on how to get that done is Barack Obama. Let's see. So my concern with the Obama dick riding is that what will happen is Obama will become the Reagan of the Democratic Party. If you're curious about what I mean, if you've ever watched any of the Republican debates, whether it was 2012 or 2016, Republican candidates talked about Reagan as if he were their God, as if he were the be-all and end-all of everything that it means to be a good American, a conservative, a human. And the Democratic worship of Obama in retrospect is getting to that level, to the point where it almost precludes rational thought. And my fear is that a lot of Democratic politicians, and by a lot I mean basically all the moderates and centrists, will use the thinly veiled excuse of we need to defend Obama's legacy in order to not pursue any kind of progressive policies. And then they will further imply that whoever wants to go beyond that is not adequately respecting the greatness of Obama, and maybe they're just secretly racist because they can't accept the greatness of this bold black man. Anyway, that was what had me in a white-hot fury, and I'm a little bit over it now, but I'm still pissed off. I'm sick of hearing about how great Obama was. He was not he was not a great president. At best, he was a very average president. I would say he's actually below average. All of the presidents of the neoliberal era have been complete trash. He may very well be the best of that lot, but that's like being the best player on the 2011 Charlotte Bobcats, which only won like 10 games in an 82-game season. That is not a badge of honor. We need to let that go. We need to let it go now. The talking time in this debate was also absolutely shameful. It was deeply unequal and completely unfairly enforced. I'll get into the speaking time when I talk about candidates' performance if it becomes relevant to how well they did, but suffice it to say that Joe Biden spoke for literally more than half the time that, or more than twice the time that Yang spoke. And when Yang was called on at one point, Buttigieg interrupted. The moderators did not stop him. He got to take Yang's turn. Then Yang was able to interject later, and after talking for 15 seconds, the moderator said, thank you, let's move on. And Yang was not the only victim of this, but he was the most egregious example of someone who was being frozen out of the conversation by the moderators. There were also severe microphone issues. This hurt everyone, but especially affected Bernie Sanders, and his mic kept popping, and it made him sound like absolute shit. He had a sore throat, or maybe allergies or something like that, but the microphone was clearly making it sound a lot worse than it was. I noticed there were also some pops with a few other candidates, even Buttigieg, who's a very clear and smooth speaker. So I don't know what the problem is, because ABC's mics sounded worse than mine. I got mine for around $100, and I'm assuming that a major corporation is spending more money than that on their audio equipment. So I don't understand what the problem is, and they actually have people who are experts in adjusting audio. So again, I can only assume that either they're incredibly incompetent, or it was a very weird attempt to make Bernie Sanders sound worse by affecting everyone negatively and hoping that it hurt him more than it hurt everybody else. I don't know. Also, one interesting fact of this debate that is unique so far is that whereas in the first and second debates Elizabeth Warren was treated with kid gloves and almost admiration by the journalist, we even heard some people describe Warren as identity politics for journalists. In this debate, that was definitely not the case. Warren was actually under fire from the moderators at a few points, and she was not helped out by them the way that she was in previous debates. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out one of the most noticeable things about this debate. There was someone who was conspicuously absent despite the fact that she was clearly qualified to be in this debate, and that her poll numbers put her above at least two people who actually made the debate. I'm talking, of course, about Tulsi Gabbard. Had we had Tulsi Gabbard in this debate rather than Castro, Klobuchar, or Beto, this would have been a much better debate, although I don't think even Gabbard could save this train wreck. So, now that we've gotten my preliminary remarks out of the way, let's get into who lost, who managed to tread water, and who won. For those of you who aren't familiar with my previous debate analysis videos, what I'll be doing is looking at these candidates in terms of how I think they advanced their popularity with the Democratic electorate. What I'm about to say does not necessarily reflect how I feel about the given candidates. To lay my cards on the table, I am a Bernie Sanders supporter, and I've even given him money. In 2016, I actually knocked on doors for the guy. That being said, I'm trying to analyze this from the perspective of what I think these candidates will gain or lose based on this debate performance with the party base and independents as a whole. So it is something of a Keynesian beauty contest rather than me simply stating what I feel about these candidates and their performances, if that makes sense. Now, necessarily, my biases will come into play, so keep all that in mind. So, who lost? Tom Petty once said that even the losers get lucky sometimes. But in the case of Amy Klobuchar, she hasn't gotten lucky in any of these debates. She fundamentally achieved nothing. She took no stances. I didn't hear her say a single policy position that wasn't milquetoast and completely boring. Her campaign at this point seems to boil down to smarmy, sort of very lazy critiques of others that are divorced from substance. She tried to defend the idea of being able to have private insurance and attack Bernie on the cheap line of, well, I think people should be able to keep their private insurance. People like their private insurance plans. Her, I guess, big quip was, you wrote the bill, but I read the bill. I feel like that's like going up to Stephen King and debating with him on the meaning of The Stand. And when he tells you that you've got it all wrong, you say, look, Stephen, you wrote the bill, you wrote the book, but I read it. So she was defending private insurance, essentially. It didn't come off well. She didn't really lay out her own policy ideas. And she made an explicit appeal to voters like, hey, if you think all these people are crazy, just come hang out with me. It's the laziest shit I've ever seen. I mean, this is like if somebody came unprepared and there's no there. For me, this was the most shameful thing that anybody did in the debate. Way worse than what Castro did. The one thing that Klobuchar did that was fairly strong was in her last answer about her greatest setback. She might have had the second best answer after Biden. She talked about how she got into politics originally because her daughter had to stay in the hospital longer, and she, as a new mother, was only allowed to stay 24 hours under Minnesota law. So she, as a private citizen, got involved and got that law changed, and that's what inspired her to get involved in politics. It's actually a true story. I covered that when I did my video on her, and I think that that was her best and most human moment. But up to that point, she was completely worthless, and at this point, I'm pretty much convinced that she's running for vice president, and that specifically she wants to be on the ticket of one of the other establishment candidates to give them a woman from the Midwest. I think that's why she's there. So in other words, she's a waste of space. We would be just as well off without her on the stage because she's not contributing anything. Kamala Harris. I think if anything, she might have been the biggest loser. She had some lame jokes. She was trying to be funny and charming, but she's neither funny nor charming, so it didn't work. She had no substance. At one point, she was trying to agree with Bernie, but came off as if she was criticizing him at first, but then turned it into a compliment, so it came off as backhanded and passive-aggressive. She was saying that Bernie deserves credit for Medicare for All, and then based on her body language and expressions and what she did to Biden in the first debate, I was expecting her to follow that up with some kind of attack, but instead she said, so I took what you did and I made a better bill, which allows people to keep their health insurance. It was like a bizarre twist that didn't work. So she was basically giving us a setup and then no punchline. One of my other general critiques of this debate is that there was not enough conflict. This debate was way too tame and civil, and debates are supposed to be contentious. You have to fight to win. You have to throw punches to get a knockout. And Kamala Harris, I thought, was going to start the fight, but she didn't. She seemed very fake, and I guess she was afraid to really mix it up with anybody, so instead she focused too heavily on Trump. She mentioned Trump more than twice as much as any other candidate. She kept bringing him up over and over. At one point during the healthcare debate, she said that no one was talking about Trump enough, even though almost all the candidates, or at least 7 or 8 of them in their opening remarks, mentioned Trump at least once. So her whole thing was a joke. It was by far her worst performance, perhaps even worse than in the second debate, at least in terms of getting stuff done on stage. I think her goose might be cooked. This might be the end of the road for her. I don't know. I hope it is, but she's well funded and has a lot of powerful allies, so it's hard to say. The other person that I put in the loser category is Andrew Yang. I actually thought really hard about putting him in the tread water category. I'm not 100% sure he belongs in the loser category, but let me make my case for you. Yang started off with a really gimmicky opener about how he was doing a pilot program to prove the validity of his UBI. He already has at least one person he's funding with the UBI personally out of his own pocket, and he wants to have, I think, up to 10 people in different states, and then use them as test cases and then as examples that he can talk about on the trail. So it came off as a real gimmick. He was referring people to his website. It sounded like a weird business pitch or a limited time offer, so it didn't seem appropriate for the setting, and it frankly seemed beneath the dignity of the office of the presidency, which I guess at this point is no dignity at all, given that we have Trump in the White House. His answer on foreign policy was also extraordinarily weak and watery, and I was massively underwhelmed by it. There was also an answer he had that was really good and detailed and thoughtful. I think it was on economics. But the way that he laid it out would have required him to keep going for a much longer period of time. It was, I guess, a podcast-style answer rather than a debate answer. At one point, he made an Asian joke, which was fine. I'm not offended by such things. But I think that in the PC climate that dominates the party right now, it might have made a lot of people uncomfortable. I don't think they'll call him out because he's Asian, and you don't get called out for this kind of stuff unless you're white. But I don't think it really made him any new friends. It probably made his supporters laugh. One thing I do have to give Yang credit for is that of all the candidates, he might have made the best new point of the night. He made a really great point about how we could use democracy dollars to offset corporate spending and corporate lobbying. to support candidates who we actually like rather than who the corporations prefer. So each citizen would have $100 to spend on candidates of their choice. I like that idea a lot. But ultimately, I feel like it was outweighed by his really gimmicky opener, some of the weak answers he had in the middle, and his overall lack of speaking time. To give you the word count here, Yang only spoke 1,546 words, the least of any of the candidates, compared with Biden at 3,361, Warren at 2,600, Harris at 2,400 approximately, Castro and Buttigieg both around 2,100, Klobuchar like 1,900, Booker 2,800, Sanders around 1,900, and then Beto at 1,700. So he didn't have a lot of opportunities, to be fair, but what opportunities he had, he didn't use all that well. So I have to put him in the loser category. I could see a case being made for him being in the tread water category. I don't think he lost any of his supporters, but I think what Yang needs as an outsider is to make steady progress going into the voting, and I don't think he did enough tonight to give himself that kind of a push. And now for those candidates who managed to break even, the people who didn't fundamentally change their standing in the race, one way or the other. Or as I like to call them, the boring people. Pete Buttigieg. This guy watches way too much West Wing. He came across as highly rehearsed and unmemorable. The only thing I remember about his performance is that he talked a lot and didn't say much. He also gave a sneer at Andrew Yang for his opener, and that may have been something that really affected my perception of Yang's opener. Because his opener was somewhat unexpected and stunning, and then the first reaction we see is that of Buttigieg, who is just sneering at it and making fun of it, and then the audience kind of laughed a little bit when Buttigieg did that. So that was really his only impact on the debate, though. Outside of that, he didn't really do anything tonight. As for Cory Booker, imagine what I just said about Buttigieg without the polish of citing West Wing, and that's it. He was there. Booker was in fact on the stage. He got to close out a lot of segments for some reason. He didn't really say anything that had a point. He relied very heavily on pathos without making any real points. Something similar to Harris, but maybe a little bit better. So he was less cringeworthy than Harris, but otherwise not too different. It was hard to watch. I think he was actually for Medicare for All in this debate, but he didn't really say anything too strong in that regard, so nothing he said really stood out. So again, very forgettable. The guy who is garnering the most attention, and this may end up helping him, who knows, is Julian Castro. For the most part, I think he actually had a pretty strong night in terms of having things to say and being relatively strong. He also had a decent amount of speaking time. He got around 2,100 words in, which puts him about number 4 in terms of time speaking. So I think overall he was doing pretty well. The thing that people are talking about now, though, is the attack he made on Joe Biden. I defend this attack on 2 grounds. One, Castro had a good point on the substance, and Joe Biden did need to clarify this. This was something I was actually asking out loud to the people I was watching it with. And 2, this is a debate. You have to draw some blood, and I respect that. This debate was way too civil. I don't like civility when it comes to people just being way too polite to each other and not getting into the nitty-gritty and slugging it out. I want my debates to be bare knuckle and bloody. I don't like this civility horseshit. If you're not going to fight, don't get on the stage. That's how I feel about it. Okay. So, Castro attacked Biden because Biden had earlier said that his public option would have a buy-in, that you could buy in at any time. He was also saying it was universal health care, however, and clearly that is something of a contradiction, because if you have to buy in, then it's not universal, since a lot of people can't afford to buy in. And that's basically what Castro's point was, but Castro made it in a very aggressive, heavy-handed way. And then he attacked Biden for not being able to remember it and came off as very petty and underhanded. The real problem here is not that Castro was out of line. I don't think he was. I think that he was right on this point, even if he was a bit of a dick about it. But the problem is that you can't make these kind of attacks if you don't have charisma. You have to have a certain amount of charisma to be nasty. You have to have a certain amount of charisma to jab at anyone. If you're not likable, people will not side with you even if you're right in an argument. That's just a fact of nature. And for Castro, he has enough articulation to be able to make points and get applause, but if he's going head to head with anyone, it is not going to turn out well for him because he is a blank slate when it comes to charisma. He has had to reinvent the way that he talks to sound more like Obama so that people will think of him as being in some way likable. But the fact is that he is kind of a miserable dick. Another thing, I hate to say this, and I feel like it's potentially very disrespectful to Castro, and I don't mean it to be this way, but in terms of his debate style and his general smarminess and unpleasantness, he actually reminds me a lot of Ted Cruz. Another guy who doesn't have any charisma and is, frankly, very punchable. Castro is a much smarter politician than Cruz, and he is very knowledgeable, but he is not likable, and this guy is profoundly unelectable. If he were ever to be nominated or put on the ticket as a VP, he would do a shit ton of damage, which is unfortunate, because like I said, Castro is a smart guy, but holy shit, he lacks any form of personality, at least in a positive way. I do have to give him some credit and put him in the treader section, though, just because he did have the balls to attack someone and to take a risk. There are a lot of candidates on the stage who needed a breakout moment. In a field this crowded, you absolutely have to break away from the pack. Buttigieg, Booker, Harris, Klobuchar, O'Rourke, all of them also needed to break out, and all of them decided to just coast. At least Castro had the audacity to try. So credit where credit's due. The attack probably failed. It might end up backfiring, but who knows, maybe just the attention will be positive. I think he'll end up breaking even because people will at least know more about him, and the people who would be turned off by him are probably not that many, given that I just don't think that what he did was too over the top, and I think it more violated the ethics of the very soft people who report on these debates rather than outraging the sentiments of the average American. As for Beto O'Rourke, he received universal praise from the entire field for his handling of the El Paso shooting. He spoke without making errors, he made sense, and once again he maxed out his potential. The best that Beto can be is sort of a generic Democrat who doesn't make mistakes. That's as good as it gets with Beto, and for that reason, I'm now firmly convinced that he's gunning for the VP slot. He wants to be the nice guy to the fighter who gets on the ticket. He wants to just be the guy who shows up at mass shootings, cries with families, and does some head of state functions so that whoever becomes president can do the governing part. That's really what Beto is offering, and I think that because of his position in Texas and his high name recognition, he'll try to sell himself as someone who can potentially bring over Texas for the Democrats. So at this point, he's running for VP. I don't see why he needs to be in the race to do that, just like with Klobuchar. He doesn't bring anything in terms of substance. As far as I'm concerned, he can drop out. I don't really see the point of him being in the field just to campaign for vice president. We're trying to find a president. So, again, kind of a waste of time, but he didn't do anything to hurt himself. The last on the treader list is Joe Biden. And with Biden, he's another one where I can see a case being made for him being on the loser list or even on the winners list. Biden's performance was all over the map. He was a few stumbles shy of a win. Had he been able to avoid a few brain farts, I think he'd have to be in the winner category. There was one foreign policy question where he was the Joe Biden of 2008. He was very informed, he was factual, and he was really following the line of argumentation crisply. For a while. Then he started to ramble, and he ultimately got saved because his time ran out and the moderators ended it. And I think that was sort of emblematic of who Joe Biden is at this stage in his life. He's still got some of the old Joe Biden charm and fire. He's still got some of the knowledge. It's just that his brain doesn't work 100% of the time anymore. He's becoming a shadow of his former self. There was another time where I don't even know exactly what he's talking about because he lost the thread so badly that he confused me. He said something about a TV, and then he corrected himself and said, no, a record player. These kind of senior moments gave a lot of evidence of cognitive decline, but Biden was also pleasant and likable. I think ultimately, if you like Biden going into this, you probably still think that he is pretty good. On terms of substance, he was a little bit better than in previous debates. He did articulate his positions relatively well early in the debate. And his closer, like I said at the outset, was very strong. He talked a lot about his struggles with having family members die on him. And because of that, he came off as pleasant and likable. And I don't really know if this will affect his poll numbers at all. If anything, I think that he's going to either gain or lose maybe 1 point because of this debate. At any rate, nothing really happened, but it was interesting for these 5 people. Just as there were no dramatic failures in this debate on par with what we saw in some of the earlier rounds, there were also no dramatic victories or standout great moments. If anything, the best moment of the night was Andrew Yang talking about democracy dollars, and that was a strong moment interspersed with an overall piss-poor performance. The 2 winners here, though, I think, are Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Sanders' victory, if it is a victory, was very narrow, and I almost put him in the tread water category. Despite having a sore throat, microphone issues, and being placed on the defensive from the outset, Bernie was able to promote Medicare for All and defend himself adequately, even if not brilliantly. While he didn't get to speak much, Bernie actually had the 8th most speaking time despite being 2nd or 3rd in the national polls. And by the way, in 3 out of the 4 state polls that have come in, he's actually in the lead right now. So you would think you'd want to give that guy some mic time since voters actually care about him, but that's not what ABC did. He did manage to stay on message with the little bit of time he had, and I think that he adequately spoke to people's needs and desires. His performance was definitely a major downgrade from the second debate where he was dropping elbows on Delaney and Hickenlooper and all of those clowns. But it was still adequate, and given that he had a sore throat coming in, I thought that the whole field was going to try to pounce on him while he was weak and try to knock him out of the race, and I was very surprised they didn't do that. Relieved, but also surprised. I just didn't expect them to show mercy to any extent. There was one point in the debate after the Medicare for All fight where he didn't get to talk for 30 solid minutes. And like I said, he got to speak the 8th most, which is an example of odd media bias and an odd decision to allocate minutes, since the amount of words that people got to speak had no relation to their poll position, with the exception of Joe Biden, who got to speak the most. Elizabeth Warren, I feel, was the biggest winner of the night, but even her victory was only a slight one. It was maybe good for 2 or 3 points in the polls, and that's the biggest shift I could possibly imagine out of it. She proved significantly, however, that she has the ability to handle some degree of bias and hostility from the moderators. In the first and second debates, she was pretty well treated by them, and this reminds me of when, I think it was Jimmy Dore said that Warren represents a kind of identity politics for journalists. Up to this point, she's been handled with kid gloves, and there are all kinds of rumors that she's been doing her damnedest to get in bed with the establishment and win their support in the likely event that Biden's support collapses. If tonight is any indication, then maybe her efforts have been in vain, because normally the moderators are very kind to her, but tonight they clearly weren't as favorable to her. She didn't have any stellar moments. There's nothing that she said that I thought really sounded like a game changer, but she did come across as charming and informed, and she did a very good job of humanizing herself and telling some of her backstory, like her time as a special needs teacher, going back to law school as a single mom, and stuff like that. Um, I know my girlfriend sort of leans towards Warren, and I think that she was very impressed by Warren's personal appeal in this debate. Speaking of other people's impressions that I've gotten a chance to encounter, one of my friends who was over at the house watching the debate is a big Yang guy, and he thought that Yang did worse than I thought he did, actually. So, but then again, I talked to a couple other people I know via text, and their Yang supporters think Yang did well. So, again, impressions are all over the map. I guess we'll see what actually happened in the minds of most voters when we get the polling results. But these are my thoughts, and of all the debates I've covered so far in this cycle, these findings of mine are the ones that I'm the least confident in by a long shot, because this debate was very boring, and I didn't really see much happening on screen. So my overall prediction is that these debates will not have a big impact on the polls, but again, I could be wrong, and I am not confident in that prediction. But that's the fun of making a prediction video. You never know when you'll just be massively wrong or completely right unexpectedly. We'll see what happens. Feel free to make fun of me when I totally fuck this up.